People look at the NBA now, and 80% of the players in the NBA are black. And people don't even know about the fact that, there weren't any black players until 1950 in the NBA, and that it started with a trickle.
In that first year, 50, Chuck Cooper, coming out of Duquesne, was the first one drafted. Now that's, I guess, sometime in April or May. Sweetwater Clifton was the first one to sign an NBA contract because the Knicks bought it from the Globetrotters, whom he'd been playing with. And Earl Lloyd then was the first one to actually play a game because that's the way the schedule broke. Barksdale came along the following year because he'd spent that first year still playing out on the coast here. And say in 50, 51, 52, 53, the segregation mentality is still very strong. Now in those days, those first four players were looked upon primarily as rebounders. And that became very much a pattern for the first set of black players. The stereotypes in people's minds are very strong. And you're a big, strong guy, you concentrate on getting the ball. You rebound, defend, and that's your job. I think Clifton suffered the most from that because he could have been a much, much better offensive player. But that isn't how they used him, and that isn't the role they had in mind for him.
Sweetwater Clifton, now he came from the Globetrotters, so he was much more experienced in this kind of ball, and he played, he was like a center. Earl had a good outside shot. He drove to the basket, big, strong guy. And Chuck Cooper was similar to Lloyd. He was a good shooter, well-built, and they were all good players.
What I find really interesting in terms of the old guys, they had huge baggage to carry. Black players could not live where white players stayed. They had separate quarters in terms of getting themselves ready for games.
Earl Lloyd came to Washington, was a really good player. And when we traveled in some of the cities, that it was a different situation. We could not have Earl stay at the same hotel that we were in. And Bose McKinney, who was a Southern man from North Carolina, and I offered to room with him at a hotel that he could get into. I mean, this sounds terrible because me being from the West Coast, I went back there and I didn't know any of this stuff.
Baltimore had won a championship in the second year of the league. When they came in the league, they were the league champions in 48 seasons.
Baltimore was a place where they operated in a shoestring. I think it was 1950, and they wanted me to be a player coach. So they phoned me and asked me if I would be interested, and so they made a deal, and I became a player coach. In the meantime, they had signed Don Barksdale and Dave Miner from the San Francisco Bentners.
When he came into the NBA, he came in as one of the 10 highest paid players in the league. And he came in not only being a player, but also having a post-game radio show. Who knows? He may have been the first in the league anywhere to be a player to have that while he was playing.
He was a smooth guy. He could run like a deer. So it made it look good for me to be coaching a player of that caliber. And he could really run, and he was very good around the basket. And Don put out all the time and did a good job for me. Despite the fact that he hadn't had experience in this type of a game, he did well. And what I have to say about Don, and this is why I think that he would have been one of the greatest players in the NBA, that when he came the first year, didn't have an outside shot, but it took him the 1 year to really develop the 15, 18-foot shot, and so that made him much more effective and difficult to guard.
Later, he played with Boston, and they started to started to catch on.
Box rolled into Boston in a big white Caddy convertible somewhere around 1953 when we traded for him. And I'd never met anyone who, as I say, who enjoyed life quite as much as he did. And athletically, none of us had really seen a player who could do the things, athletically that he did on a basketball floor.
He made the All-Star team. Yeah. He was a hell of a rebounder. He had rebounding he could do. And he was fast. He could run for his side. He was tenacious.
Bob Cousy made me feel completely at home and opened the door so wide open that he brought me in like a brother. And Red Auerbach made one thing very clear, and this is what he said: "You give me 100%, and you don't have to worry about anything. You'll play."
I mean, it's like, I guess, evolution in terms of Don was the first one athletically that was able to do some of the things that Jay and Michael and all the other great athletes now have brought to the next level. Point guards love to get guys that move without the ball, that move quickly without the ball, and of course who shoot pretty well, and Box had that in abundance.
I have vague recollections of seeing him on television, and I think I saw him play for the Celtics when television was just starting in the 50s and they started to do NBA games.
I grew up in New Jersey, and obviously there weren't a lot of African Americans playing basketball at that time. I think Sweetwater Clifton, Don Barksdale, Earl Lloyd, and Chuck Cooper were the only ones playing at that time. And so when you had an opportunity to see an African American play, it really just made you well up with pride.
Boston rivaled Montgomery, and folks at Boston may not know that yet, don't want to deal with it. Boston was rough in terms of racial relations.
I mean, bigotry's been around since Adam and Eve. I mean, if it's not black-white, it's got to be something else. We brought in a lot of guys from like the Deep South, who might have had pretty strong biases coming in.
There was much less direct opposition to the black players in basketball by their teammates and opponents than Jackie Robinson had to go through in baseball.
In 13 years, from going from Coop to Box and then Russ and Casey, Sam, the whole thing, I mean, I never remember any racial overtones within the unit. Auerbach, in that sense, I think deserves a lot of credit in terms of how he handled the black athlete coming into the unit, and I thought he kind of rose above petty bigotry.
We didn't win the championship, but we came in second behind the Lakers. And the Lakers had Mikan, Mickelson, and Pollard, and they were tremendous basketball players.
Box was the perfect spokesperson, just as Jackie was for baseball as well, in that in terms of his participation as the first black athlete in an All-Star game, they couldn't have chosen a better guy at the time.
Don was one of the most gifted athletes I had ever seen. And I found him to be a fine man, and I was proud to play with him.
He finished the year before Russell came, before they became great.